what we're doing with AI, right? We are teaching sand to think. And that's kind of crazy. Language is a record of how the humans perceive the world. Video is actually the real representation of the universe. The effect that artificial intelligence will have, it will multiply GDP growth by major integer points, like, 10 times, 20 times. The washing machine had a bigger impact on the world than the internet.
Hi, my name is Yasmin Khoetler, and this is The End of Limits, the AI podcast by Humane. With me today, I have Amit Jain, the founder and CEO of Luma. Thank you so much for being here today, Amit.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Luma is a startup focused on building visual intelligence through multimodal models, I guess, and a bit of a boring way of saying that you guys create incredibly cool visuals and videos for anyone to easily access. And prior to this, you worked at Apple on the Vision Pro team. So you've had a long history, and today you're here with us in Riyadh. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up here.
Yeah. What brings me to Riyadh is the work that we are doing together with Humane. We are building this entity called Humane Create. And the idea is to basically bring AI to most creative pursuits, whether that is for marketing, whether that is for advertising, whether that is for gaming. And gaming is a big deal in Saudi Arabia, as you know, with the recent, when this airs, it might not be that recent, deal with EA, right? So the idea is currently, AI is getting more popular or pervasive in areas where text is involved, coding, analysis, these kind of areas, right? But creative work is actually a huge part of the economy. Just think about this. Every company in the world advertises and spends actually a huge amount of their total revenue on advertisement because, you have to get the word out. How would people know what you make, right? So how do we bring AI to those processes? How do we actually, automate a lot of that, make it very, very fast, make it, in such a way where, as soon as you think of an idea, can you actually put it out there? So Luma and Humane are working on many aspects today together. This includes, by the way, so I'll tell you a little bit about, what we do in a second, but our current generation model is called Ray 3. Mm-hmm. And it is a state-of-the-art video generation model. And I don't mean that, in a metaphorical way, state of the art. Currently, it ranks neck on neck with Google's VO and above OpenAI's Sora and those kind of models, right? So it is actually one of the world's best models. And we are going to work with Humane to build a kingdom-specific video and image model. So think about it. All the values, all the dresses and appearances and the local culture can be then represented, right, in these generative models. These generative models is how people will communicate in the future, right? People already mostly communicate through video, get their information through video, news through video, entertainment through video, right? Imagine it is not just controlled by Hollywood of what people see. It can be actually here locally and represent the culture locally, have local stories and these kind of things. So that is something we're doing. And then most importantly, Humane and Luma are collaborating on one of the largest clusters ever built to build multimodal AGI. So we're going to bring 2 gigawatts of compute here in the kingdom. And it's going to be about 75% of Luma's global, inference capacity. And so Luma and Humane are working to build out that multimodal AGI cluster. We are still working on a name of it. By the time this airs, it might be final. So this is what brings me here.
That's incredible. There's so many topics to touch upon there.
Lots. Yeah.
And I think, I'll try not to get ahead of myself, and we'll sort of talk through point by point, and maybe start at the very beginning, sort of defining what we mean by intelligence, right, and artificial intelligence, because I think you have a very interesting take on how we should be focused on multimodal intelligence. And so tell us a little bit about how that differs from sort of a regular intelligence text-based system that can't reach multimodal.
Yeah. Text-based systems, LLMs, which are large language models, right? They're language models. They're the first step in artificial intelligence. They are not the end-all and be-all. And then the reason is very simple. First, let's start by defining what is intelligence, right? To us, to humans. Yeah. I mean, there's no absolute definition of intelligence. This is intelligent, this isn't, right? That doesn't matter. It's all relative to humans. Things to us that can think and that can reason and that can operate in our world, right, appear intelligent. Things that cannot, things that look like, it just keeps striking into the wall. We're like, oh, that's stupid, right? Which is the opposite of intelligence, obviously. So intelligence, in a simple way to define it, is systems that are able to operate in our world, systems that are able to do things we do, and super intelligence is systems that are able to do things better than we do. All right. Now, things we do is not limited to writing and reading. In fact, most things we do actually happen in the physical world. Most things we do are not just in language or communication. Most things are actually having to do with, like, how we operate in the world, like, how do we move things around, or what constructions we do, all of this, right? So intelligence, artificial intelligence especially, it's not sufficient to just have language models. They're good at, things language is good at, right? Like, analysis and coding, and they're insanely valuable, don't get me wrong. And I believe you mentioned you're talking to Amjad, who's working on coding models, right? So those are really, really useful, no question about it. But in order for artificial intelligence to actually affect human lives day to day, we need to build multimodal models. So what do we mean by that? Human brain, and like, we operate with all our senses. In fact, the most important senses are vision and ears, right? We need to build models that not only can understand text or language, but that can also see the world, that can also hear the world, that can also operate in that world by, like, touching and moving and manipulating and all these kind of things. Until we do that, we're not going to have artificial intelligence that understands all our context, right? Imagine if you had an assistant, or if you had, like, a coworker, but they couldn't see, they couldn't hear, they couldn't actually, like, operate in the world. They could just, like, get your text and get your text back. That is really frustrating, right? Because at all times you're like, yeah, but, like, I see what you're talking about. Do I have to describe the whole thing to you? This is what using language models is like today. You have to describe the whole situation to them. It's like, oh, this is what's happening. She said this is what happened. And then, like, I tried to do this and I tried to do that. It's insane, right? We need to build systems that, so this is the mission of Luma, where, like, so building multimodal AGI that can generate, understand, and operate in the physical world. That will happen when we combine audio, video, language all together into one brain, like the human brain is, basically. So that's what we mean by multimodal intelligence. Why it matters, right? So without multimodal intelligence, it's not possible for AI to actually operate in the world, AI to actually, like, help us in designing cities, AI to help us in our day-to-day life, in our homes, right? If you want to build robots that are actually general purpose, that, like, can actually help people, can actually, like, change the physical world, you need them to have a mental model of the physical world. For that, you need multimodal intelligence. For that, what you need is what we called world models. And Luma is building, and Luma is actually, like, one of the very, very few companies in the world that is actually tackling this problem of building unified world models, right? Models that can understand all of this information, and the models that can operate on all of this information. So yeah, it's extremely important. The first step of that is generating, creating video models. Why does that matter, by the way? So yes, generating video is immensely valuable for advertising, for media, for entertainment, for news and education, and all these things. Great. But you know why video is very important? Video is a record of the physical happenings in the universe. Video is how we see how the universe behaves around us. All right. Just like language is a record of how the humans perceive the world. Video is actually the real representation of the universe. When you train these models on video, you know what they learn actually? They learn physics. When you train language models, they learn reasoning and logic. When you train video models, they learn physics. When you combine them together, you now have world models that can reason through and operate with physics.
Interesting. I forget who gave this analogy, but I think it's very apt to what you're describing of sort of telling an LLM how to interact in the physical world now is if you tried to teach it how to play the piano and then you gave the LLM some notes, but then you had a different LLM come in and you gave those notes to that LLM, and sort of the second person was trying based not off of their own experience, but just based on notes that they read from someone else's. So it's just this inefficiency that you get from not having real world experience and not being able to actually try things on your own.
If I could kind of use a different analogy, it's like you can read about swimming, but that doesn't teach you anything about swimming. You can't swim. You could read every book ever written about swimming, and the moment I drop you in the Red Sea, you sink. That is the difference between reading about it and actually seeing it, and having that physical intuition of how the world works. So yeah.
So really, when we talk about Luma today and the projects you're working on of create and based on video generation software, but the scope and the goal seems much larger when we look on the longer term of how do we actually work with robotics and physical hardware.
Video is the path to that.
Video is the path to that. This is, of course, in contrast to a lot of people who think the opposite way, where we're going to go from LLMs, which they already think are very general, which to a degree they are, and that we're going to go into more and more specialized agents. And you're saying, actually, no, we'll go into an even larger world model.
Yeah. This is a question about, this is not a philosophical argument, actually. This is a proper engineering argument. Specialized models are good because they're faster, right? They are helpful for higher precision and those kind of things. But it's not sufficient to have once you have intelligence that is actually truly general, you can then derive specialized things out of it. LLMs are now kind of getting to a point where they're kind of plateauing, right? The last two generation of LLMs, they increased in performance by few percentage points here and there. It used to be multiples of jump of actual integer multiples that we used to see between GPT-3, GPT-3.5, GPT-4, or take any of the company's models in that same regard. But now we're kind of running out of data to train these LLMs. First of all, AI is not magic, right? AI learns just like humans learn from observation. What they observe is data, right? But when you kind of don't have any more new data to train with, all you're left to do is improving that data, cleaning that data, improving your training process and those kind of things. And you start to get slower and slower and slower gains. Mm-hmm. But where the gains are actually completely unbounded right now? When you start to introduce video data into it, when you start to introduce audio data into it, and then new capabilities start to emerge. So when we start to think about agents, the question is what do you want to do with it, right? If this agent is supposed to do things like HR, if this agent is supposed to do help you with writing novels and stories and those kind of things, I think the argument makes sense. Let's make more specialized LLMs that are, or fine-tuned LLMs that are good at those things. That's great. Nothing wrong with that. But when we think about the general problem of artificial intelligence and agents that are able to actually help us make a movie, help us do this podcast virtually, where you just represent Amit and is able to do something. But more importantly, help us do economically significant and valuable work like construction, like physical manipulation, like planning of cities, like reasoning about why did something happen, right? You first need to climb the hill of multimodal AGI. Mm-hmm. That's the next step. So in certain domains, yes, we should start making specialized tools that are sufficient to use with text. That's fine. But in the grand scheme of things, currently, the biggest hill to climb is let's make a brain that is better than the human brain. And that is not going to happen with text only.
That's fair. I think the argument to push back against that would be not that this is inherently valuable, but that it's incredibly costly to create from the training to the inference.
Sure.
How do you look at tackling that issue?
You're getting intelligence. Nature spent 1.1 billion years getting humans to where we are, right? We're able to do that in a decade. You're getting intelligence, right? If you see actually the current investments in AI across the United States, in China, and now in Saudi Arabia as well, the impact. Okay, I'm going to take a slightly different path to explaining that. The washing machine had a bigger impact on the world than the internet.
How? In what way?
The washing machine freed up 3 hours a day of people's time, because especially women, right? In many parts of the world. But we all wear clothes, especially before before now, where clothes now are dirt cheap, and Some people can afford to just wear and throw them away, right? Very wasteful. Don't do that. But you could. We all wear clothes. We have to clean them. We all sweat in them. This is necessary. So washing clothes is essential. Washing machines, and it's a very fascinating study. It's worth looking into that. It's from the Stanford Business School, right? The washing machine freed up 3 hours a day of people's time every single day. So many people were able to join the workforce because they didn't have to spend time cleaning their clothes. It's kind of crazy what that ended up being. The internet, of course, has had an immense impact, right? But the washing machine brought so many people to the workforce, right? The impact of artificial intelligence is not we will be able to do things more efficiently, faster, those kind of things. No. The impact of artificial intelligence is to redefine the entire economy. Everything. See, economies are built on constraints. It's like something that is in low supply ends up being more, and low supply but high demand ends up being more expensive, those kind of things. Imagine if we are able to deploy these multimodal models and labor becomes accessible. Labor becomes a thing where humans are not involved, not at least to the extent right now, if you want to construct a big building, a decade, right? At least in the US, you guys are much faster here, but because of human labor. It's not because it takes so long to get cement from point A to point B. You could say that, approvals take time. Fine, 2 years of approvals. Let's remove that time. But after that, it's all human labor. When you think about manufacturing chips, right? Yes, once a fab is built, it's pretty much all automated. But building a fab, oh my God, right? It's an entirely human labor-intensive process. When you think about manufacturing, when you think about major parts of the economy like healthcare, they're all bound by human labor, right? The effect that artificial intelligence will have is not it will add 1 or 2 points to the GDP growth, right? It will multiply GDP growth by major integer points, 10 times, 20 times the actual output capacity. This is what the world needs today, right? So then if you look at the investment commensurate to that, it doesn't look like actually that expensive, right? Not many companies in the world can do that, by the way, right? For instance, in the Western Hemisphere right now, if you think about multimodality and then companies able to make these kind of video models, and again, remember, video models are not important just because they are able to make videos. Video models are important because they're a representation of the universe, right? And they're going to lead us to this path of generalized intelligence. There's Google, there's OpenAI, and there's Luma that ranks in the Western Hemisphere right now, of the level of companies that they're able to achieve. And the spend is large, but the spend is nowhere near what the actual effect and what the actual impact of this AI is going to be. Data centers are going to be the factories of the future. Data centers are where intelligence, many human activities are bound by intelligence, right? If you had access to a lot more intelligent people, your life could be so much better. They could help you, think about, career paths. They could help you think about, what do you do day to day? They could help you think about, where should you live? They could help you think about a lot of things. Human life and human growth, and by the extension, countries are bound by intelligence that they have access to, right? Brain drain is a big, giant problem for, India, for instance. And conversely, everyone who moves to the U.S. is a big asset for that country because we get to have the best people in the world, and that leads to economy that just accelerates and accelerates and accelerates. Intelligence is the big limitation on growth. Intelligence is a big limitation of improving the human condition. So when we think about the cost, we have to compare it against that.
And then it seems dirt cheap.
And that's dirt cheap. It's nothing. What we're doing with AI, right? We are teaching sand to think. That's what we're doing with AI. And that's kind of crazy. That's kind of like a science fiction. But that's what it is, a chip that is made out of silicon, right? So those of you who don't know, right? Wafers, the chips on which all of AI runs, on which all of computing runs, on which all the iPhones that you have in your phone runs, right? It's made out of silicon. Silicon comes from sand. Right? Literally, it comes from sand. We purify sand, we melt it, and after some insane processes, it becomes a chip. A chip, tiny, tiny, tiny thing that is actually intelligent. So It's crazy. We're teaching sand to think.
Try explaining that to someone in Saudi Arabia 100 years ago.
And then, I mean, it's a big asset.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's incredible. And I think reminds me, Ray Dalio recently announced that he started building an AI clone of himself for exactly this reason. You know, like now you can have time with Ray Dalio to ask him for investment advice. So I don't know exactly how good his clone is yet. So I'm not saying take his advice, but it's, you know, it's a testament to in the future what you could have. And incredible democratization of intelligence.
Yeah. Okay. So we think about education a lot at Luma. Video is the most impactful way, or video is actually the simplest way to learn anything, right? And then you're seeing that in the patterns right now. So actually, let me tell you something very interesting. Currently, on average, people are spending 3.5 hours every single day watching videos on their phone. 3.5 hours per day. This doesn't include television time. This doesn't include cinema, but who cares, right? 3.5 hours. So this number is average. So that means like younger people, the number is actually much higher. Older people, the number is lower. Now, some people who would hear it, they would say like, oh, it's brain rot. They're watching so much video. They go out and play. They should be reading books. No. This 3.5 hours is not just sloth and entertainment. Some of it is. And humans have a need for entertainment, right? Like, even in the old times, I'm sure, early men in caves had, entertainment. Some people would dance, some people would fight, whatever it is. So humans have a need for entertainment, no. But the 3.5 hours is not just entertainment. It's a lot of news. It's a lot of how-to. It's a lot of learning. If you think about, the biggest revolutions in education in the last 20 years it's YouTube. YouTube, you can learn nearly anything, whether it's on math, whether it's on physics, whether it's a vocation, whether it's how to repair something, whether it's all these kind of things. Video is the most impactful way of learning, right, of education. Currently, if you then look at the other side of schools, like in education, most people hate mathematics, not because mathematics is hard. Mathematics is actually very logical, and human brain is very primed for that, but because they had terrible teachers who made mathematics into a memorization exercise. So by education, I'm a physicist, right? At Apple, I did a lot of work on quantum optics and these kind of things. And the math is actually really, really simple. But the way it is taught, it's horrendous, right? And imagine if every person in the kingdom and every person on the planet had access to personal tutors, right, that had half the intelligence of LLMs, for instance, right? Let's say we make it very cheap, we make it very fast. And they had a persona. They were able to show you anything. They were able to, this is what we're building at Luma. This is what video actually means, right? So we call them AI humans. And imagine everyone having access to a tutor.
I mean, throughout history, it was always, the wealthier people who could afford to have a tutor would always have their kids taught one-on-one. And that is, with studies proven to be the most effective model, but we've just never been able to. How could you have done that before?
That's right. Now, this is possible with AI. So now think about the cost of it compared to that, right? Let's say you are a rising nation and you want to so this is really interesting to think about. Many nations in the world right now have a huge population dividend. Are you familiar with the pyramid, the population dividend pyramid? You mentioned Ray Dalio, so his book, Why Nations Fail, right? He talks a lot about that. So population dividend is this idea that the more young people you have, right, the faster the country and the economy can grow. But see, only if those people are skilled. If they're not skilled, then it's a squandered population dividend. Every country, as it educates and grows, will have lower and lower birth rates. It's a given at this point. We know that, unless we change something very significantly about how humans live with robots, right? So that also will change.
Washing machine 2.0.
Exactly, right. Imagine you don't have to do 90% of the day-to-day mundane things that you have to do. What life would be like. Anyway, coming back to this. Education is this thing where how quickly you can deploy it affects what the trajectory of a country is going to be like, right? So, for instance, India, if you compare India and China, right? India and China are virtually very similar nations. China is about 20 years ahead. But you know what China did really, really well? Educate the population. India is doing that, but it's slow, right? Now imagine a new country like Saudi Arabia, for instance, right? Saudi Arabia is sitting on a big population dividend. Being able to educate the young, and not just on vocational skills and things like that, but on hard sciences, being able to teach them at their own pace, each person having their own AI tutor. This doesn't replace teachers, by the way, right? Teachers actually are there as a person, but then they go home and learn at your own pace, learn things you are good at. That is what these models will allow us to do. That is the societal value of AI.
And I think important worth noting that, the China, Saudi Arabia societies where the government allows you to have these sort of long-term visions of like 5, 10, 15 years, you can look into the future and invest. What worries me more about the States is, you have like these 4-year terms that sort of limit how long-term thinking you can be. But even then, the investment in technology is so high from the private sector side that I don't see an issue in balancing that out.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't comment on political systems at the moment, but these countries have different kinds of memories. I agree with you, right? So in Saudi Arabia, it's like the kingdom is able to see very far and it's able to plan and execute and those kind of things. In US and in India, for that matter, right? Like in India, the government terms is 5 years, right? So all the same in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. The memory is more institutional. Right. And you think about plans and things like that, like institutionally and in private sector is very, very, very flourished. And at least in the US and India, it's kind of getting there, but not quite. So, yeah, like I think there are differences in government governing models. And you see different effects coming out of that. No question about it. But private companies do have a very large role to play in this, especially in the AI era, because we're going to see a few companies, right? So why Humane is really important, right? Because without Humane, I think without Humane, the region is dependent upon other countries to I mean, just the products. All you can do is use ChatGPT. That's it, right? ChatGPT knows nothing or not much about the culture here, about things here. So why it is really important to build and invest in this kind of infrastructure is again an example of long-term thinking. It might not be profitable day one, but nothing is. But long term, this gives the level of sovereignty that's really hard to come by, and it takes time to build it out, right? An AI company, especially the kind of Humane is building, large scale infrastructure, applications, deployment, education, takes time. The investment has to happen yesterday, right? For it to actually be able to yield its benefits, by 2030, something of that nature. So, yeah, I think different modes of planning, but must be done one way or the other.
I think it's interesting you point that out because there's an element of you need to be thinking far enough ahead into the future, but you also need to be almost prescient in that you spot something before others do, at least. And that's something I think you give yourself a little credit with Luma of, joining the AI wave a bit earlier on. Yeah. And tell us a little bit about how you saw that opportunity and why you thought, okay, this is going to play out long term. This is going to be big.
Yeah. You need to be in the field to be able to see it, right? So let me tell you kind of briefly the journey of it, otherwise it'll take forever. So I was at Apple, from 2017, late 2017 onwards. And we were working on, so first when I joined, we were working on the LiDAR sensor and our teams were responsible for the, bunch of things that happened with it and use cases for it and all these things. But then we started to work on Vision Pro. And, Vision Pro is interesting for many reasons. But in this case, we were building two things. We were building one, they're called personas. So imagine, and then Vision Pro has it already, they shipped our work. So you could be sitting in Riyadh, I could be in the United States, and we could talk to each other like we're sitting across from each other. It's full 3D and it's absolutely photorealistic humans. And currently only Apple in the world has this technology that our team built, right? And in order to reconstruct humans in that level of detail, you really actually have to build out the physics for it. You have to train models that are able to do that. Every person is so different. Your hair is different today than it will be tomorrow, right? Your expressions will be different today than they are tomorrow, depending on what you're talking about. There's million things that are happening. There is no way we could just write code and represent all of that. Impossible. People have tried to do it. It doesn't work. You need generative AI and you need these large models. So, we were starting to work on that at Apple. And in 2020, I started to see a couple of things. One, as 2020 is 3 years before ChatGPT, by the way, right? Language model scaling was starting to work. But so let me tell you a little bit about that actually. For 20 years before 2020, people did this thing called natural language processing, NLP. It was this idea to understand natural language and to be able to talk to computers in natural terms. And then you need to understand what the person say, what was their intent, and what was the intent behind the intent, all these things. People built so many systems, elaborate systems, all these things, and nothing worked. It worked to some extent, but most of it was pretty terrible. But you know what the most importantly didn't work? Actually being able to produce language. So understanding, we were kind of starting to get there. But generating language, not really. And then around 2019, 2020, people started to make some somewhat larger language models. By today's standards, they're tiny models. But still, and you could start to see the thing produced a sentence that is coherent, right? And that was crazy. That was actually crazy at that time. Then, we started to see the same thing in visual world. We started to see very early image models and video models actually not at all, image models that were starting to put pixels together, and it kind of looked like a banana, right? And it kind of looked like a person, so in 2020, especially late 2020, the realization was inescapable for me that if, right, there was a big if scaling can continue to work, we would be able to recreate reality in these models. We could be able to build world simulators in these models, right? I didn't know how at that time, how we would do it.
Yeah, because that's a big leap. I mean, going from DALL-E being able to generate, somewhat accurate images to saying, actually, we could recreate the entire world.
Correct. But I mean, you see the patterns. You see the basics of the transformers. The transformers are the algorithms we use for actually making it. You see that, okay, it was trained on a bit of data. What happens when you train on a lot of data? What happens if you don't have just a few transformers? What if you have a lot of transformers? What if you don't train it on a few hundred GPUs, well, a few 100,000 GPUs, right? And as engineers and as researchers, we are trained to think about limits of this is me, end of that's right. So we're trained to think about in the limit of the idea, what happens? We talk about this all the time that okay, if you take the limit of this idea, what happens? What I mean by that is then you take it to the absurd lengths. What happens, right? It's really, really important tool of thought. Okay, if someone is telling you that by doing this, you can make this much money, right? It's okay, what is the limit of this idea? In the absurdity of it, if I do a lot of it, what happens, right? Does the world collapse? I don't know. So we started to think about that. And by 2021, early 2021, the conclusion is inescapable for me that okay, if this does work, you know what we will have? We will have a world simulator on a laptop. We would be able to recreate reality. We would be able to think about okay, what happens a few steps ahead? If Minority Report, we will be able to predict the future. We will be able to and it sounds a lot like science fiction. It's not. That's what an LLM is doing. It's predicting the next word, right? That's what our video models are doing. It's predicting the next frame. So that's kind of where we are. But so my choices were twofold at the time: stay at Apple and build this in there, or leave, right? And then start a company. First choice was obviously I'm here. Let me try to see if I can do something here. So I brought this up to a couple of the SVPs and our chain of our management chain. And for better or for worse, Apple really did not understand AI. And you can say even today, if
you look at Siri,
exactly. Look at Siri. It's quite astonishing how they didn't see most of it. So someone said something funny to me, and I won't name names, was that images will never be created on GPU in 2021. And at that point, I was okay, if this is the thing here, I would have to spend 3-4 years convincing these people. And life is short. This is not what you move to Silicon Valley for, by the way, right? You move there to take risks, to start companies, to try something out. What is the worst that could happen? We would fail. And we would start another company with learnings from that and better ideas, right? So I left in late 2021. And the idea was if we just hired 15, 20 of the best people in the world, we could actually do most of it, right? And then we didn't need Apple's money. We could raise easily, right? So I left in August. By September, we had our first round done, right? And it was a competitive round. We had 12 term sheets. And I had not raised money before, by the way, but our idea was actually really, really solid. And since then, now Luma has the highest concentration of multimodal researchers in the world. We have so many people from Google DeepMind, actually, people who get really high caliber people who get frustrated by Google's politics and the slow, internal fights and tussles. They actually come join Luma. We have actually such a strong pathway. Our chief scientist, Zhangming Song, he's one of the inventors of diffusion models that power pretty much all of our research. The person who invented a 3D generative AI, at Berkeley, he leads our applied research today. We have some of the best engineers and researchers in Valley, actually, so not good by outside standards, but not by, no. Luma is considered to be the premier lab for multimodal research today in Silicon Valley, right? So we succeeded in bringing some of the best people in the world together. And that has shown in what we have been able to do. So Luma is still by Foundation Lab standards, Luma is a very small company. We're about only 100 people. But if you think about it, what we do everything from training the models, building the products, and doing the deployment of those products across, and we currently work with 30 of the Fortune 50 companies, right? So we are very small. That's one way of saying that. But when we shipped Dream Machine 1, okay, the only thing people knew about video models was when OpenAI had announced Sora but not released it was February of 2024. They had announced, but it took them a year, end of 2024, to release Sora, right? We released our first model in March of 2024. We had been working on it already, and it caught world by surprise. And there was the first time people could just type in and "Good Morning America" and news segments and things like that, and people were talking about it okay, well, I could just type and it just does it, and what the hell, right? It was a huge revelation for the world. Then we did it again in Ray 2, so we changed the names of it. In Ray 2 again in early 2025, where it was the first scaled video model in the world. And after that came VO, and we now know that it affected VO's roadmap very significantly when we released these models, right? So Ray 2 was the first scaled up video model that could do really realistic motion and physics and then these kind of things. And now with Ray 3, we released the world's first reasoning video model, a video model that is not just taking your words, prompts, and making pixels out of it, not like a translation. It can think. It can generate pixels and generate emotion and stuff like that and think okay, is this correct? Does the physics look right? Is this what the person is intending to ask for, right? Am I generating too many fingers in this hands? It thinks about those things. If it is, then it will correct them and then produce the output. So just like thinking language models have been a huge, huge thing in the world for improving intelligence, thinking world models are going to be the thing that actually takes us to world intelligence. So that's been the journey so far. We're with partnership with Humane now and some of the things that we have coming on very soon. We think the future is going to be really, really interesting.
That's super exciting. Do you think there's, in terms of direction, intent, emotional intent, let's say, ways in which the model is still lacking, and what do you think are those parameters where it's still falling short, and what do you think is required to really get it there?
Oh, these models are always falling short, right? Here's the reality of artificial intelligence. Have you heard the term overturn window?
Yes.
Right. So anytime someone uses these models, right, first time, they're blown away, right? They try a lot of things and things like that, and then the model starts to work for them, and that's great. But then their ambition expands. It's what if I can make a whole movie, right? And then you're oh well, then the ambition has surpassed the model, and then we make the next model, and then their ambition surpasses further. This is what humans are. Humans are these curious creatures. If you give them a tool, if you give them anything, they will try to find the limit of it. It's where does it break, right? I don't know if you're a fan of Star Trek, but I'm a huge Star Trek nerd. And the reason is very simple. This the whole premise is based on humans are explorers. We want to find new worlds. And then why? Not to conquer them. We just want to know. right? We want to find new worlds. Every time we release a model, people are blown away by that. They start to do new things with it, and then they find new limits of it. And that is so rewarding, because that means we are never out of job, right? That means like our users, our customers keep pushing us into new and new things. So for instance, Ray 3. Ray 3 is the most cinematic model in the world. Like the physics, the animations, the particle effects are so great, actually, right? But now we're talking to some of our partners at Amazon and Netflix and other places like that. And now they're like, oh, wow, this is so good. I want to make a full television series out of this. And you're like, okay, then the model should have to remember the whole story. It's like, oh shit, now we need to have context lengths that are in not millions, that are in billions, right? I'll tell you something interesting. When we released Ray 3, so to your audience, this might be a metric that they're not that familiar with, but we measure in number of tokens generated.
Right.
So that's a common thing to do. Video models, think about it. Language models are producing words, and I think that's great. Coding models are producing code, so they produce a lot more tokens. Video models are producing reality. They are such hungry beasts for compute and token. So our first launch week, we ended up generating 1.8 trillion tokens. To give you sort of an understanding of that, when you are talking to Humane Chat or ChatGPT, an answer generally is about 200 tokens. That's it, 200 tokens. So 1.8 trillion tokens is kind of mind-boggling amount of compute, what it is producing. And now trajectory is only accelerating. So this is the nature of AI. You give humans those models, they're like, okay, what more can I do? What more can I do? And so we are always improving. And now we have gotten to a place before it used to take us a year to produce a new model, right? In 2023. 2024, we got it to about 6 months. And now we have built so much infrastructure and so much knowledge and data and know-how. We're able to produce new models every 3 months. And so you're seeing pace of AI is increasing. And the reason for that is very simple. Once the infrastructure exists, you can just build better and better and better and better models, and it just gets faster and faster until you hit some limit, right? So for instance, LLMs are hitting the data limit right now.
Yeah.
So even if I can produce a model every 10 days, it doesn't really matter, because I don't have new things to give it or teach it with. So, but in video land,
Well,
I'll give you an example of that. So all of text data that LLMs are training on, right? It's 15 trillion tokens, all of it. You can get more text if you went into people's hard drives and those kind of things, but that data is not really very good. So 15 trillion tokens. 15 trillion tokens of video is created by humans on the planet every day. All of text of all of humanity, from Library of Alexandria onwards, right? The Arabic revolution that happened in science and engineering that gave us Arabic numerals, that gave us algebra and math and all these things. All of that included is 15 trillion tokens of text, video. Every single day, humans produce more video. Right. Now you can make the case it's not as intelligent as algebra, obviously.
sure, there's redundancies, but I mean,
Exactly.
it's one day.
It's one day. But think about this. You get to see so much of the universe in those videos. You get to see every action. You get to see the consequences of those actions. You get to see what causes accidents, what causes traffic, what causes physical phenomena to happen. So data, it's absurd. So this is why video is so important, because this is our actually, there's another way to think about it. Text is produced by human brains, and we are limited by how many humans are there, right? And then humans are now not reading and writing, by the way, just to let you know, right? Video is how they're operating. So text, actually, the rate of production of it, LLMs have already taken over, how much text is produced, but we can't train back on LLM data. That's going to cause the snake to eat its own tail and collapse, right? Photons, on the other hand, right? The universe, the most abundant entity in the universe is photons. The observation of the universe. There's 1.5 times 10 to the 89 photons combined, including the cosmic microwave background radiation, things like that. The ultimate form of AI, the ultimate form of models that are able to model the universe are going to just be trained on photons. This is why visuals matter. This is why, multimodality matters.
That's incredible. I think, just so we don't run out of time, because I do want to talk about this as well, we talked briefly about the economic effect this is going to have. I imagine similar to the agricultural revolution, there are going to be so many new jobs created that we have no idea what they look like today. But one thing, of course, that video generation gets a lot of people excited or concerned about is, what happens to artists and creative people particularly. So how do you see, you work with Netflix, you work with large studios today. How are they thinking about the role of artists and actors and all of these folks?
I'll take you back to the stat I said a little bit earlier. People are watching 3 hours of video every single day, right? Let's discount everyone who's in China for a second. That's about what, out of 8 billion people, 5 billion people, right? So also remove young kids who can't watch video. Give or take 5 billion people, right? That's 15 billion hours of video that is being watched every day. There is not enough artists in the universe to actually produce that, right? The demand for video is so insatiable. All of us can leave our jobs and just produce videos, right? There's not enough people. So our job's going to change 100%, right? But this idea that AI is going to take jobs from artists or creatives especially, it's actually a hoax, right? With AI, it will be possible. So, okay, think about it this way. Currently, where are movies made?
Hollywood.
And?
On phones?
Bollywood. Right. So it's Hollywood, Bollywood, and some in Europe. That's it, right? European movies are not very good. Sorry. I try to watch them. It's too much. Like French movies, cannot. Just some action, some drama. Like, it's very easy to make good movies. No, it's not. But see, the movies are made in Hollywood. Movies are made in India. And I said, stories that are being told, like the effect movies and television has on culture, it's insane. America exports its culture through Hollywood, right? People care about disco. People care about all these things or used to, Hollywood, right? But there's a flip side to that. Only the stories that are approved by Hollywood can be told, right? Mm-hmm. And the world has actually way more stories. The world actually is way more complex. If you wanted to make the Hollywood of Saudi Arabia, you can't. You can buy things out, but you can't, because the production pipelines are in LA. It's the same reason that, I can spend a lot of money, but I cannot manufacture smartphones here, right? Like, in India, they're trying to do it, right? But you can't, because the production pipelines, the whole ecosystem is over there. You know what short circuits that ecosystem? Video models. Imagine, you don't need massive sets. You don't need 200 million, 500 million, billion-dollar budgets to make movies. This is how expensive movies are getting now, right? The blockbusters, the summer blockbusters, easily the budgets are in the 400 million, 500 million. You can't spend that, if you don't have that concentrated, pipelines to actually guarantee that you're going to get a return on this, right? So Hollywood is the only place where you can actually do that. And in fact, Hollywood is dying, right? Because of the spend that has gotten. So you can only try so many ideas. The big problem in Hollywood is that, new ideas are not being greenlit.
Right.
New kind of movies are not being made. Just go back 20 years. The sheer number of movies that were coming out and the new kind of things that people were trying that ended up becoming cult classics, right? Hollywood is not doing that experimentation anymore. What we need to do is build generative AI studios here in Saudi Arabia, in India, in Poland, in Nigeria, in the Netherlands, in the UK, in every country. So we can tell the stories of those countries that are interesting to people there, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean you're not going to watch Hollywood movies. Sure, you will still. But there are so many stories that are interesting here. Today, I've been out of India now for 17 years, right? And it's actually longer than I was in India, right? Wow. So at this point, watching these movies, right, that come out of it, actually is a big deal for me because it gives me this is what's happening. This is how people are talking. This is what the kind of things that they think about, talk about, all these things, right? Stories have the power to move people like nothing else. Stories are everything. We communicate to each other through stories. This podcast is a story. I'm telling you a story. You are believing or building a story. Your life is a story in which you are the main character, right? The main character energy. Stories move worlds, right? And currently, very few people can tell the stories. And that's crazy to me. So if you're thinking about jobs, millions and millions of new jobs lie ahead in being able to tell the stories of each group, each country, right? We just can't do that today. So I think that is where we're going.
And for you, what does this medium mean necessarily for intelligence? So do you think that the way we are talking about these multimodal models now and how they perceive intelligence, obviously different from our brains, which are incredible things for the little amount of energy that they run on. How do you see that interaction shaping sort of a new form of creativity to allow these stories to be told?
So if I understand your question correctly, what you're trying to ask is that what new kinds of stories will be told, or
it's more so we have general intelligence as humans, and we're building some
we
form.
don't.
You don't know?
That's a topic, but we don't. One human is not good at everything.
That's true.
You know what so the biological organ brain is generally intelligent, that a brain is so adaptive that given enough time and resources, it can learn any skill, or mostly any skill, right? So brains are substrates for general intelligence. Every human is actually quite generally intelligent. Like, general intelligence is not an absolute thing. Like, how general, right?
Yeah.
So, but see, it doesn't matter what I do right now. I don't know how to perform surgeries, right? I can teach myself. And that is general intelligence. Like, can you learn given enough time, right? But no one human is generally intelligent. All of us together as a race are generally intelligent.
Okay. So as human beings, if we are capable of general intelligence, let's say, and these machines are being made to be generally intelligent, right? Our AGI, we're trying to reach that ASI, whatever you want to call it. How does our mode of interaction with them look like?
Understand. Okay, got it. Language. We're going to talk to them like how we talk to each other. We're going to show them like how we talk to each other. We're going to draw on paper and how we talk to each other, right? Because that is the most natural language or natural medium of interaction for humans, right?
So we actually will interact with them the way we interact with people. So moving from, right now we've had sort of graphics and visual interfaces and moving
code
forward.
And these kind of things. They're all like, temporary appendages. If something on the other side is generally intelligence and it passes the Turing test, right, you should just talk to it like a person, right? This is what people want to do, by the way. This is not like a big idea of like, maybe in the future we would do. No, people want to talk to computers. The problem is they don't understand, right? Like, what we're trying to say. Like, I'm sure you've seen a million TikToks of people talking to Alexa, right? And the comedy that ensues from Alexa being not very good, right? Or at least like before LLMs, Alexa not being very good. Now it's getting very good. So the moment you give people an interface which is like, hey, you can show it, you can point to it, and you can say in words, people are like, great, I'm just going to talk to it like I would talk to a person. Frustrations happen when the other person is not as intelligent, right? Or they don't understand your language, right? That's when it's frustrating. So, yeah, as we go forward, for most day-to-day things, we will interact with these systems like how we interact with people, all right? For the not day-to-day things, for the more specialized things, more precise things, like, healthcare, architecture, city designs, legal, and these kind of things, we will use the same methods we use today. So one of the North Star we have at Luma, so there's two things we think about. One, robot brains, right? That's where the general multimodal models go. And the second is to design a rocket engine. And I'll tell you why that is important. To design a rocket engine is it's one of the most concentrated efforts of intelligence that humanity performs today. It is such a complex thing. You go, oh, I'm not a rocket scientist, right? I go, this is a saying, because like it is one of the hardest things humanity does. Even for a company like SpaceX, designing a new engine is easily a 15 to 20 year affair, right? Why? Because like it is absurd that the physics that you have to master to operate at thousands of degrees and to be able to push thrust in hundreds of thousands of newtons, it is crazy. See what rocket engines allow us to do, right? They allow us to escape the planet. They're currently one of the hardest things that humans do. And the way they're designed is it's everything. It's text, it's CAD modeling, it's simulation, and then it's producing the real thing and then iterating on it all over and all over again, right? With LLMs, we can't do that, right? It's just not enough. With multimodal models, that is where we will go. Imagine you can run the simulation inside the engine, right? Inside the model and see okay, is this material good enough? Is this we able to do? Everything else is then a baby version of that.
Yeah.
Right. So how will we talk to those kind of systems? We will talk to them how we talk to these systems today. We will draw and sketch and build out okay, and we will look at the metrics and we look at the numbers okay, if this rocket simulation is running, okay, what is the yield strength that I'm seeing right now, or how much fuel is being consumed, and all these kind of things. So we will adapt and we will learn to do this at higher levels of it, but it will be really interesting because so many more people will have access. I mean, I don't know if you want to design a rocket engine. That's not my point. But yeah, I think more companies should be able to.
But I think you can expand that. I mean, I am super bullish on this idea of, innovations in hardware. Iterating on these is going to become so much cheaper and so much easier. And it'll really remove some of that roadblock people had to come up with innovative hardware as opposed to just software.
And see, that is, have you seen Ready Player One?
Yeah.
Exactly. So if we don't, software is so easy to improve because it's just all on the laptop, right? So software gets better and better and better and better every year. But our physical hardware, our atoms, our electrons get better, but our atoms don't improve. It takes a decade to see noticeable improvements in cities and living conditions and all these kind of things. Imagine if it improved at the speed of software. It is possible. And then we have seen evidence of it, whenever computers have come into play. Before CAD modeling. Okay, CAD modeling has been one of the most revolutionary things in humanity's life. Before CAD modeling, the kind of the building we're sitting here, the Medjool Tower, this curvy structure, without computers, without finite element analysis, without CAD modeling, without simulation, impossible to do. The best things we could ever design were a few story tall brick, structures. That's it. The kind of bridges we design today that have fundamentally changed the human condition. That is what multimodal AGI brings to the table, right? It makes it so easy, to be able to do those kind of iterations that hardware shouldn't be this expensive. So I really like the way you put it. I think that is a really, really, really significant point. Software, yeah, we can iterate on it all day. Hardware, we can't. And that is a big difference. It's everything from national security to economy to daily lives to housing crisis to everything.
Yeah, it goes back to the whole transformation of GDP and economy and the ways we live today and washing machine 3.0. 2.0. All right, then rapid fire. I think to round up, tell me one thing you're really excited about that you think is going to happen in the next year.
I think we will publish our first model that is able to do this kind of multimodal thinking. I am really excited to see what it would actually enable.
Yeah. That's really cool. And one thing that keeps you up at night.
Oh, so many things keep me up at night. Jet lag, one of them. Compute build out keeps me up at night.
Mm-hmm.
These are all dreams if we don't have compute to actually make them real. The cost of compute keeps me up at night. The speed of deployment keeps me up at night. I spend an inordinate amount of my mental energy, and why I think humane partnership is really material for us and for people who use our products is that access to compute. If it goes the current way, 2 companies, 3 companies on the planet will have compute and nobody else. That cannot be. That is a sovereignty issue at national level. But that is also an equality issue, very much. Imagine if you had access to AI that was that could do all these things we talked about, and I didn't. Suddenly, it's like a tiered society, and in a much more sinister way than anything we have today with capitalism and oh yeah, there's tiers. I mean, it's a necessity. It falls out of that. But it would be much worse, much, much worse. So compute keeps me up at night.
I think a lot of founders would share that worry.
Yeah. Foundation model companies, if you're not thinking about computer, I don't know what the hell.
And then one way in which you use AI that you think other people should be using it for as well.
I use R models a lot for visual thinking.
What do you mean by that?
Okay. So people are starting to use ChatGPT and language models a lot for like thinking and analysis and that sort of stuff. Humans are very visual. Imagine being able to see those things. Anything can be represented visually. I'm very visual. So when I think about team building, when I think about not team building as in team building exercises, as in building our team, when I think about structure of our models, when I think about the, data and those kind of things, I generally ask Dream Machine to lay it out for me. Like, okay, how would this go? What is the flow chart of this? What is the structure of it? Laid out in front of me, like what are all the aspects that I need to think about? When you see it visually, compared to a list, right? It really registers. It really changes your mind. I would highly encourage people to think more visually, draw more visually, put everything out in front of you. Those madmen things of 1,000 things on a wall.
Yeah.
Do more of that. The level of clarity you get from visual thinking is actually something else.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you so much for being here today, Amit. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.